Look at Miller's Chapter 5, Number 5. A nation's government has determined that mass transit, such as bus lines, helps alleviate traffic congestion, thereby benefiting both individual auto commuters and companies that desire to move products and factors of production speedily along streets and highways. In other words, the government has determined that having buses transporting people to and from work would alleviate traffic congestion so that those who do need to drive don't face as much congestion and the tractor trailers aren't facing as much congestion. That's what all that means. Nevertheless, even though several private bus lines are in service, the country's commuters are failing to take into account the social benefits of the use of mass transit. So this is actually an old debate about public transportation, such as buses. The argument being pretty much what's stated here is if more people rode on public transportation, that would be fewer cars on the road and be less traffic, less auto emissions and all that kind of stuff. I find this question interesting now that mass transit is a place where people would be coming together, and we struggle with social distancing in these places. This being recorded during coronavirus. Certainly, we've probably overinvested at this time in mass transit, and I'm sharing that thought because, as I've alluded to a couple times, I think now, understanding or knowing what to believe about statements like this is a little bit tough to do. And again, we're assuming that it isn't, that we could say, well, if the government says this is so, it's so, let's draw it, and that's what it'll be. Certainly right now, I don't think there's anybody arguing for more expenditure on mass transit when, um, people want to be in their own cars, and people aren't going as many places anyway. So that's just adding to the confusion, in hopes of pointing out that the confusion is what makes that kind of confusion that ends up largely being often political statements is what makes understanding these concepts generally tough to do. But we will overcome by focusing on the model and what would be if we could see through all the noise. Okay, so here we go. We are to discuss in the context of our demand supply analysis the essential implications of commuters' failure to take into account the social benefits associated with bus ridership. So if it were true, and if we knew it were true, what would we do? What could we do? That's what we're talking about. And so here is the free market quantity supplied equaling quantity demanded of mass transit seats, tickets, however you wanted to measure it, and that would be the price at which the quantity supply would equal the quantity demanded. But what is being suggested here is people just don't realize all the other benefits that aren't being incurred by them personally, but by society as a whole, of riding on the bus. And if they were to realize that, they would value it more than they currently do, so that the demand curve would be higher than it currently is in the free market provision of this good or service. And so, since the demand would be higher if it were to represent all of the value that's out there, the parts that people don't realize, then we would be talking about a social value curve. And by them not realizing it, what we're saying is that there's a positive externality out there, and we're not factoring that into the free market. So the social value curve represents that with what would be higher demand if we did value it. So that is what we're really getting at, and why whenever we're talking about a positive externality, we're talking about the free market provision, the free market demand curve being too low. Whenever we're talking about a negative externality, we're talking about the private supply curve being too high. And with negative externalities, we have the social cost curve to draw into our model. With positive externalities like this, we have the social value curve to draw into our model. And since the demand would be higher, the optimal quantity would be higher. I might be getting ahead of myself and answering B now, but that's okay. And we can't say that the price should be higher, but in order for the sellers to be willing to produce the optimal quantity, they have to be compensated to do so. And that level of compensation is this price. So this has to be the price received to achieve that optimal quantity. Now let me have a look at B before I go too far and make sure I'm not just answering way above and beyond the question and missing things I should be saying. So, discuss in the context of our model, well, we have that, the essential implications of commuters' failure to take into account the social benefits. It means that the optimum quantity is not being achieved. We're underproducing or consuming that good mass transit. Now, I'm glad I stopped myself. Letter B is explain a government policy that might be effective in achieving the social efficient use of the bus service. Well, since the sellers would need to achieve this price in order for this quantity to be made, and that's the optimal quantity. And by the way, some people, if you're thinking, well, if bus riding is great, why wouldn't we just have everyone ride the bus and no one drive cars? That's too far. That's too far. That's part of what makes this so difficult to understand, is that some people would advocate for that and say that is the optimum quantity. They are overplaying the hand. That's just not so. The optimum quantity just compensates for how much more the good actually benefits third parties, everyone else, not the advocates of mass transit. They might benefit a whole bunch from it, but that isn't society. That they might benefit for it because they work in mass transit. That isn't society's benefits. That's their benefit. And they're going to advocate and say society's benefit is huge. And that makes it difficult. If we could pin down what society's benefit would be, it would be this height. That's what this model is telling us. And the way to get there is to subsidize mass transit. The easy way would be to tell the consumers, if you ride mass transit, you will get this benefit from the government, and the benefit would just be this many dollars, this height right here. I'm not going up there. I'm going from this bar to this bar because these are parallel, these lines, and we want to shift up vertically to that social demand curve. It's a movement out because there's more demand. But how much out is this much vertically, and that's a dollar amount because this is our price number scale, right? So we want to move this whole thing up parallel this height, and that gets us out here. And that means for those sellers to produce that amount, they have to receive the amount that I showed there. But to get that amount, the consumers weren't willing to pay that much. They weren't willing to pay that. What are the consumers willing to pay? The private consumers are willing to pay for the Q-opt amount this much. So that's the amount that they pay. This is the amount the sellers receive, and that is because the height of those is the subsidy. And that's why that subsidy has to be that height throughout our straight line model, is to elevate demand right up to the social value curve so that we can get out to Q optimum. Now the government spends this rectangle, and it's geometrically, that's base times height. That's how much they're spending in dollars or cents, is the subsidy times the amount that is actually being bought, which is now Q-opt. So the government spends all that. We have what's called dead weight loss, or an inefficiency right here, this triangle, because the consumers and sellers aren't actually being made better off by just that amount. So we have an inefficiency there where the government's paying for more than there is benefit to the market. But we explore that more in the next chapter about taxes and subsidies. But that's what would get us there. And let me just circle back to this question, make sure I haven't missed anything before I stop recording this. Explain a government policy that might be effective in achieving the socially efficient use of the bus service, and that would be to subsidize it right by the amount that it is currently undervalued to raise demand up to the social value curve. If you're looking to answer this in Pearson MyLab, your answer choice should be something along those lines.